last main type of literature that I want to talk about is discourse. And the most common places to find discourse literature in the Bible are things like the legal commandments, prophecy, the New Testament letters, which are known as the epistles, and in extended speeches by characters within narrative stories. So the things that we learned in grammar school, in our English classes, on how to compose a letter with an introduction, a body, a conclusion, things like these are helpful starting points when thinking about biblical discourse. And so because of this, many consider discourse the easiest to understand and interpret. It's something that we're really familiar with. I mean, after all, who needs special help to understand that all have sinned and the wages of sin is death? And by grace you have been saved through faith, or the imperatives such as walk by the Spirit, walk in the way of love. We need little help understanding and interpreting these things because they're very direct and we're very used to them. I want to read an excerpt from another great book by Fee and Stewart called How to Read the Bible for All It's Worth. When we read biblical discourse, things can be a little trickier than we might think. Referring to things in something like the Discourse of 1 Corinthians. On the other hand, the ease of interpreting epistles can be quite deceptive. This is especially so at the level of hermeneutics, or our interpretive strategy. One might try leading a group of Christians through 1 Corinthians, for example, and see how many are the difficulties. How is Paul's opinion in 1 Corinthians 7:25 to be taken as God's word? Some will ask, especially when they personally dislike some of the implications of his opinion. And the questions continue. How does the excommunication of the brother in chapter 5 relate to the contemporary church, especially when he can simply go down the street to another church? What is the point of chapters 12 through 14 if one is in a local church where the gifts of the Spirit mentioned here are not accepted as valid for the 21st century? How do we get around the implication of chapter 11, verses 2 through 16, that women should wear a head covering when praying and prophesying, or the clear implication that they do in fact pray and prophesy in the community gathered to worship? It becomes clear that epistles are not as easy to interpret as is often thought. So while we may be very familiar with discourse, sometimes when we read biblical discourse, it can be very difficult to interpret. And so the first thing that we have to try to do with any of the epistles is to form a tentative but informed reconstruction of the situation that the author is speaking to. What was going on in the court that caused Paul to write 1 Corinthians, for instance? How does he come to learn of their situation? What kind of relationship and former contacts has he had with them? What attitudes do they and he reflect in his letter? These are the kinds of questions that we want answers to if we're going to interpret the scriptures well. The first and primary way that we can do this is to consult a good study Bible, and I have mentioned some earlier in this course. But if you look at a good study Bible, it's going to give you a great introduction to the book, and you can also look at Bible dictionaries and commentaries that will help provide a lot of the background information that's not readily jumping off the page at you when you read the Bible, but that can be very helpful in our understanding of what's going on in their context. A second way to do this is to develop the habit of reading the whole letter through in one sitting. Read and reread, and maybe make brief notes as you read. Make notes about, what do you notice about the recipients themselves? Are they Jew? Are they Greek? Are they wealthy? Are they slaves? What are their problems? What are their attitudes, etc.? Maybe make brief notes about specific things mentioned as to the specific occasion of the letter. Why is this being written? And then you can make some brief notes about the letter's natural, logical divisions. These kinds of things will help us understand the letter and the intention of the author more readily. Some letters are difficult to read perhaps in one sitting, but do your best to read the whole thing because that is how the letter was designed to be heard and read. Much like a love letter today, we wouldn't go and receive a love letter from our sweetie and read the first paragraph and then put it away and then come back to it a day or two or a week later and read the next paragraph. We're going to read the whole thing. And that was how Discourse was designed and intended to be consumed by the audience. So practice reading biblical discourse literature in one sitting to the best of your ability. And these things will help us to see some of these themes and be better able to answer some of these types of questions that we ask of the text so we can get closer to the author's intended meaning and not just what we want it to mean.